Hi, my name is Benedict. This is part 2 of a pair of videos. I'll probably basically bring you up to speed in this one, but really it would be better if you went and watched part 1 as well. I will look to linking it down there. Everything seems backwards when I'm watching the camera. Very simply, to bring you up to speed, I met a fellow called James in a forum called Drupal. He presented a track that he was working on, and the mix, while there are things I liked about it very much, the mix has some problems. So I offered to take his stems and work through some of that for him so that he could see the mix, how it probably should sound. And so the stems came over. The last video I open it up and I look at it and I run through a lot of advice on what should happen. Now the aim of these videos is not to tell you how to mix. It's not a how to mix course. I've done some of that stuff, but I'm always very cautious because you can't do that in 5-minute tutorials, and there's a lot of damage that gets done in that. What we're looking at here is really that situation where you do send your music off to be mixed by somebody. You gather up your stems and you send them off to a mix engineer, and to understand from the mix engineer's perspective of what happens, how this goes, what they're doing, what they're trying to do for you, the obstacles that they face. So this time I'm actually going to start by playing you the original track. Here it is. Now what you probably notice straight away is that it's a very harsh or brittle mix. There's no real body, oomph or welly in that at all. I liked how bright and glossy it was. I really did. I actually quite liked his balance of his instruments in there. It had a really cool 80s sort of a feel to it, but at the same time it's just far too brittle to be presentable. And I knew that the work must be far better than that. So I brought over the stems. Last video was showing you me pulling them up, and I raised a lot of questions out of that. And those questions I actually fired off, and I asked, "Hi James, I have everything sorted." Explained that I'd made a video of this, and a few questions. As you'll see, I seem to have many copies or versions of the same track. Is this deliberate? I was expecting a whole song here. We discussed that. It wasn't fully written song, it turned out, and I sort of half knew that, but at the same time, just being me, I thought, oh, you have a whole song. Reason for that is that you really should not be mixing a song until it's finished writing, because mixing's about delivering the vision of the track. Now I know there's a lot of stuff where people talk about, oh, but mixing's all about sound, man, and you know, it's all just about the sound and the layers and making it big and all of that. To each your own, and a lot of that comes out of EDM, where they just tend to pile things on top of each other and not actually remember that a track is a story through time. But a mix, a good mix, a great mix, is about taking the parts that you've got and balancing them up in a way to tell the story. How can you tell the story if you've got bits missing? Kind of like, how would Star Wars work if there was no Luke Skywalker or no Darth Vader? There'd just be some people running around. There wouldn't be any sense of center to that story. So that's why I strongly recommend, don't mix a piece until it's finished. Nonetheless, we got what we got, and I'm not unhappy with that. I noticed some guitars were only on the left, kind of unusual. I was also confused by some of his naming because, silly me, I was expecting it would be verse, chorus, verse. But he's actually done it the other way around, which is chorus, verse, chorus. Now legally there's no reason you shouldn't do that, but it was unusual. And because he'd named some things but not others, it didn't manage to come across to me. So it's important for you as a client, when you send off to a mix engineer, that the mix engineer does not have the ability to step inside your brain. You're not sending a photocopy of your brain to him. You're sending stems, which don't talk for themselves, so name them well. If you've done something different or unusual, point it out. Your mix engineer's not going to be upset about it. He doesn't need to know all your aunt's names, but if you've used an unusual verse-chorus type structure, just let him know. It's going to be easier for him, less stress for him, because he wants, if he's a good engineer at all, he actually wants to get inside your shoes to some extent to understand what it is you're trying to get across, so he can deliver on that in at least the first mix. So we worked that out. Again, not the end of the world, but it was unusual. I wondered sort of what was played, how it was done. Again, not really much of an issue, but sometimes it's just kind of nice to know. Even though it may not have any impact, it helps me to know, this is what I got. I feel comfortable in here. If I feel uncomfortable inside something, it's actually harder for me to work it. Now you may think, what difference does it make where those sounds came from? And probably it doesn't, but it's part of me nags, so I'd like to know. I will say initially, James was not the most responsive with these questions. He really didn't want to answer them at all, and was a little toody about it. Eventually, he went and watched the video that I had made and realised that I was taking this awfully seriously. And then he was man enough to apologise. So thank you, James. I really do appreciate that. Now, the reason that I bring this up is not to say bad things about James or anything like that, but to highlight what so easily happens in the client-mix-engineer relationship. The client can go, it's gone off, it's done, it's someone else's problem, and not want to notate in the first place, as I've talked to you about naming and giving key bits of information, things like what tempo it's at, what key it's in if the person's likely to need to add some musical work. Any of those things that should be self-evident, but you really should provide them, and people tend not to provide them. And then they often feel like, well, why should I have to engage in this anymore? Well, I guess you could hand it to your mix engineer and he can automatically photocopy your brain along with it, but it's not likely to happen. So the more you can talk to your mix engineer, the easier it's going to go for you. Your mix engineer will often ask you questions. If he doesn't, then either you've really annotated everything really super well, in which case congratulations, or he may not be the right guy for the project because he may not be looking to actually understand you and what you were trying to do. He may be, as I mentioned yesterday, rushing straight into going, I'm just going to compress everything, swap all the drums for 909s, blah, blah, blah. Adding his agenda to your track before he's looking to portray your track. You've got to work out what that is. But if your engineer is coming to ask you things, even if you've paid him, still work with him, because you want him on side. You want him engaged in your track. If he feels like you're basically being a dick and being disinterested in him, that will come through in your track. It'll either come through in him being somewhat disinterested in mixing it, or he's going to be frustrated, which means that he may mix things angry. And you don't want him rolling anger into your track. It's not what you're looking for. So, we squared away a fair amount of what was happening. One of the things that I'd raised was that there were many instances of the same thing. Like, we have all these drums. We had several more basses and several more guitars, and What had happened was that as James had started to mix this, he'd wanted to put things out into stereo, and he'd made clones of tracks. Without fully realising that this was not the way you do it, he actually rolled all of those in and sent those stems off to me as well. So advice out of this, I think, as James, again, this is probably one of the first times he's done this, and it's very easy to make this mistake. But so that you're not confusing your engineer, get rid of anything that's a duplicate or not actually contributing to the track. So if it's an instrument that actually doesn't want to be in the final mix, you've recorded bagpipes, realized bagpipes really weren't that cool in your track, don't send the stem. If you've decided to clone a track so that you can do different effecting or parallel processing and then decided to back out, don't send the clones. So if you've recorded your guitar twice, then there should be 2 guitar tracks. If you've recorded your vocal 10 times, but you've comped or compiled them into one performance, you send 1 vocal track. Unless a person's asked for the separate comps, as a rule, you just condense them to the 1 track. My 2 cents, as much as possible, with your lead vocal, try and get 1 great take. Don't go, oh, that's all right, I can just fly 2 words from here, 2 words from there, and I'll compile this amazing performance. No, you won't. You absolutely won't. It's all right if you really are a great performer already. If you just happen to be Freddie Mercury and you've run through this 5 times, and we might decide, okay, you were just ever so slightly better here than you were there. But the reality is any of those 5 takes probably would have done the job. So try to have 1 great take rather than going, oh, I'll do it lots of times and put it together. It just means you're not prepared. Be prepared. Spend another week learning to deliver your part great before you go recording stuff. Then if you have comped a track, just send the 1 to your mix engineer. So that way he's not going, why have I got 57 vocals? Because in reality you've really only given him 1. It's just that they're comped. But then you're asking him to comp it again, which if that's what he said he'll do and everything, great. But if you haven't, then suddenly you've given him something that he didn't know was happening or didn't agree to, which means he may not have priced that out for you as well. He's going to be a bit pissed. So advice there, nothing to do with James, just advice on how to prepare yourself for these things. Now, I could well have gone through this and deleted all the clones, but you know what, I kind of liked them being there. So some of them I deleted, some of them I just left there. That became sort of a personal choice. If I were doing many mixes of this, I definitely would have made a mix where I killed off all the clones of things and took it 1 from 1. But I was basically liking what I was hearing, which is good. That's what you want to do when something comes across from your client, from your band. You basically do want to like what you're hearing first up. If you're disliking it, then there's something wrong. So we went through all the groups and everything yesterday. All these tracks are exactly as they were yesterday, so no differences there. Yesterday I played you the first mix, which was just taking all of these tracks, bringing them up to an even -12 dB. That was it. Played them back. Now I've got an actual mix. As I said to you yesterday, often what I will do is I'll do that first mix, return it to the client. That way we make sure we're hearing the right things. He's then going to say to me, shit, I sent you those bagpipes. I shouldn't have done that. Can you kill them? Let's not work on those. So it's a check for us both. Commonly I'll then do a second mix, which is looking to try and deliver the radio mix, which is everything that's there, doing compression, EQ, what have you, to make a nice track. Now a lot of this has been worked on already. I'm pretty confident. So some of those decisions were good, some of them maybe not so good, but it doesn't really matter because they were there and they actually sound good. So it's not a problem. But if you are going to get someone else to mix, then there's a little bit that you do in tracking, but generally you try not to make too many mix decisions at that tracking point. In this case, it's something that James had already been working on, and then I said send it to me. So of course he's made a whole lot of mixed decisions, but I got those come across, and in this case, when I say thankfully, I was basically happy with them all from a balance perspective. So, and then I said commonly I would do a third mix where I'd start to get creative and try this or try that. I decided here to kind of roll the two together because I don't have a full track. I don't know what the aim of this was, but we don't have a vocal, so at times we're a little bit missing a centre. So I've decided to sort of go the whole hog. I've made some minor creative decisions. I've decided to treat it a little bit more like it's a verse, chorus, verse, because that's what I'm hearing. Whether it's right or wrong, that's what I'm hearing based on in front of me. So that's the way I've decided to mix it. It's my personal choice, just to say this is how I'm going to present this. I've made some little decisions with an instrument as it travels through the mix. Actually, I did it with two. And probably push some things a little differently than the way I might have if there were a vocal in the track. But the vocal's not there, so I'm looking to make a radio track out of what I do have. So a little less blabber, a little more listening. Okay, so that's the whole track as I've got it. That's the whole track as I've mixed it. So up to you whether you decide that that's a great mix or not. Obviously I'll get some feedback from James when he sees this, but remember we started with something that was really thin and scratchy. We've got something now that's really quite big. We have ended up, not deliberately, but we have ended up moving from a sort of the Cure type sound and feel in his mix, partly because it was so bright, and that's something that was done in the 80s, to have those quite bright mixes, which I like, super shiny things. But these days we tend to like to have a much bigger, beefier thing because it's easy to put on vinyl. Sorry, it's easier to do on digital, whereas that was harder to do on vinyl. Sorry, get that right. The decisions that I made were now the first thing that I wanted to do was, because these ended up essentially sounding the same as each other, I wanted to make a little bit of a feature out of this distorted guitar. So when we start out, I got rid of it. Here it's not there. It was there, but because I wanted to try and build a sense of story and build over what I've got, and I only have what I've got, and I wasn't going to add any more stuff, and I wasn't in a position to add any more stuff, then I thought, well, I've got to work with a way to do that. So it's a mixed decision. So towards the end here, so you notice I create a little bit of ramp, it just comes up, and so that's like sort of saying, whoa, we're building up to something, and that makes that, bam, come in a little bit harder. And there was a second little thing that I did in here, which is here. The combination of the sort of clean guitar, which is the Robert Smithy sort of sound, and the drive sound in the third part here creates a certain sound, and I wanted it to seem a bit bigger than on the first time. I didn't want these to sound the same as each other, because when I sat and listened to his original mix in one go, I would start to become a little bored with it, because it was the same. We weren't introducing any new elements, which is fair enough because it wasn't finished. But bearing in mind I had to work with what I've got, I thought this is a way to do it. So I needed a sense of there being a little bit of difference, subtle difference, between how these guitars are before and after. So you notice, number one, we pulled out the driven guitar at this point, because I love this clean, echoey Robert Smith guitar sound. But I also really like the drive here. So I've created some difference. So it's generally louder here, which means that I wanted to do something with this, the Robert Smithy guitar sound. And you'll see here that very subtly the volume changes. So I've actually reduced the volume of the clean guitar just a smidge, just backed it off a tiny bit, because we've got lost competition from the driven guitar, and I want it to be able to push harder here. Plus, by backing it off a little bit, I'm showing off the drums and bass. I like how they sound, and I'm showing them off so that people can hear them a little bit more on their own and go, wow, don't they sound big? Because you can't necessarily have everything big all the time, all the way through the mix. It just isn't the bandwidth to do it. So often it's good to show people that a sound's big here, make it a little less big over there, and then give them another big sound at that point, and their brains will actually put it all together and think it's big all the way through. Quite silly, really. Psychoacoustics. So I've pulled back just a tiny smidge on the clean guitar, but I've actually backed it off as we go through that section. You'd think you'd start a bit quieter and maybe raise the volume, but no, in this case what I wanted to do is punch it a little bit at the beginning, but it's not doing much more than repeating its pattern. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think it sounds really good. But once we've established it, the brain will follow it even though the volume reduces a bit. And that lets us use that little tiny bit more space for the drums and bass to expand into and appear bigger. So we're showing a bit of space and a little bit of just, here's the groove of what we've got. You see, I'm not a drummer. So unusual mix decision, and a thing that you may not think to do. That's why the only reason I'm showing off that. Something unusual that had been done here in the bass. So if we take the bass and solo it at the beginning. I don't know why it was composed that way, but it was. There's an octave up. Because I chose to mix that the bass, and pull through a lot more of the pointy in it, rather than just making it big and bassy. I wanted to pull up some of the clank of it. I put a fair bell on the EQ, which pulled through that bang 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 kind of sound, but when we were up an octave, it just made that super loud, which made it sound super dumb. So to keep one, I've just made mixed decisions and just automated. So to pull that EQ out whilst it's doing that other thing. In the mix, it sounds more even overall, doesn't stick out. Over here, interestingly enough, there is a strange note, which we'll just mute this. put a bit of drive on this bass, and you can put a fair amount of drive on bass sounds, especially if you're looking to do what I'm doing, which is to make them sort of medium or brutal. But for some reason, it seems that James has chosen to play 2 notes at once. Perfectly legitimate technique, but he's just done it the once. He doesn't do it in the repetition over here, but because it's a much more complex sound, we're now driving sort of a chord rather than a single note. You can put a huge amount of drive on a single note, but as soon as you put it on 2 notes or something like that, uglyville. So again, I've just dropped out that boost to stop it from blowing the drive. So just showing you some things that a mix engineer might do which you're not going to notice in the outcome. Because I've gone for a fuller mix, it does change, and this is and this section here, the bass is not got a lot happening in the top, which I did find some trouble balancing, seeing we're going for a bassier sound overall, especially in the middle section where the clean guitar, this one, it's not doing as much. So you combine that with this bass. And they're essentially seeming to play the same thing, so they become as one, which is a nice solid sound. But seeing we've got drive happening there as well, was a case of how to have that still have its presence in the mix. But you see, I've treated this more like a chorus, so I've given that drive a lot more, drive. So just a couple of little mix decisions. I considered about things, what would I do with the end of it, but I accept the fact that this is just a fragment, so I haven't tried to end it. I thought about trying to be clever with cut and paste and put something or other in the end, but it would have just been a vanity, and it didn't add to anything because we're fully settled with the fact that it's a fragment of a piece. But we've now got a big punchy sort of a sound happening here. In the rack, so we'll less that for the moment. If we solo drums, I wanted to create a great big wet room sound. So there's a huge amount of reverb in here, and there are actually 2 of them. Because even though I've got lots of drum tracks, I've really got only the one. I've got the kit track. There are some extra kicks, but there's just the kit. So I decided I'll put them all together, and I commonly like working on a kit as one, rather than breaking out and messing about everything. Work just on EQ, balance, what have you, and go from there. So I've sent to 2 reverbs. One is more aimed at the whole kit, but predominantly the low end of it. So that's bringing out some of that lower mid that you get from reverbing kick drums, but keeping it with a more medium room, so a little bit shorter. And then in part because there's not a lot of stereo in this, I had to create some stereo, but it's just not naturally a stereo mix, which I should come back to in a moment. I wanted to put a little bit more splash on that snare, because it's kind of dry. I liked it, but at the same time as we went through, it was like, yeah, it just needs a little bit more. So I've made another reverb, tried to pull out the bottom end, put a great big peak on it. This is a sort of a parallel processing type situation. So we've got our drums, we're saying we're going to add a little bit of reverb down the bottom, we're going to add a little bit of reverb in the top, and collectively they'll be quite a lot. So it's a great big wet sand with a fair amount of flub after it stops, but it's sitting inside the mix. So that's what got done to those. Base, put some saturation on, and it's a lot of saturation. It is pushing it into drive, as you saw. That's the great big peak where I'm pulling through the clank. Used this fella, relatively slow attack, really just looking to provide a little bit of control. Initially I was putting a lot of compression on it, didn't like it. I'm generally not a guy who likes a lot of compression, not that punch it up a little bit, but I decided to take it off. You see, I've got none in the drums. I started with some in the drums, but then I thought, no, I want this bigger room sound here. I want it to feel live, even though they are MIDI drums. They're a cool kit, and I actually have that kit, and I've used it a few times on my last record, the one that's currently in the can. I've actually used that very same kit a few times. The MT Power Drums is a freebie, but very, very workable stuff, especially if you play it nicely. So, in actual fact, what we've got is a little bit of compression by just this tiny little bit. Let's see if we can do this. So do you notice how the bass suddenly becomes just that tiny bit tighter? We're only pulling off half to a dB, but because at this point it's matching the kick drums, so kick and bass just become that tiny bit tighter at that point where it's bop, 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 bop. Really nice, tight 80s sort of feel, so it just made it that tiny little bit tighter. Where I was putting more compression on it, it was just starting to pull some of the life out of it, and that's the last thing we want to do. And then collectively on the rhythm bass, where I had that on the drums initially, I took it off and put it into the rhythm bus. Again, just that tiny, tiny little bit of, we'll turn the volume down, means that we're keeping just that little bit more obvious transient on the kicks and the basses together. And so you end up with just that little bit more tightness. Of course, that's compressing the reverbs that are going on the drums as well. So it's giving them a little bit more sort of punch in the mix, because the ear is hearing the room get compressed. And when you hear a room gets compressed, that's the same as if you're hearing it so loud, your brain and ears go, whoa, too loud, and turn the volume down, just like when you stand under fireworks. You're surprised by how quiet it is because your brain actually turns it down. You see the sort of pop, and then you think, oh, why does that explosion sound so small? Because your brain's turned the volume down. So we're simulating that feel just by doing it that way. Guitars, again, tiny, tiny little bits of compression just to keep things in control. Very slow on the clean, and just a bit faster on the driven versions. Not much on the what I've turned into the chorus there at all. In terms of the masters, so this is the mix. I'll just mute that for a moment. So that's the mix. So it's a good sounding mix on its own. We could, just bring that up to normalize to 0 dB, and it sounds nice. So that means we've gotten a decent mix. Bypass, I'll actually bypass everything so you can hear as we work our way through this. It'll be one of the few times you see me work through a mix. Should I leave that off there? very subtle, tiny bit of reverb across the whole mix. I think that all of these tracks have come to me with possibly reverb or something on them. They don't sound like they need much. And I noticed when I got through, obviously those guitars have all of their delays in them, and there's a lot going on in there, a huge amount. You don't want to put reverb on top of that, because whatever's there doesn't need anything else before it turns into mud. But just that tiny little bit, so a small room. I started by popping this in. The whole thing was on 100% wet, and then just creating a sound. I think, yeah, that's kind of a nice sound to add to that. And then just finding that point where it just adds that little tiny bit to transition the mix from sounding as dry and forward to having a little bit of verb. You can't do too much, because otherwise suddenly the whole thing disappears, falls back. And we saw it might sound good, but at the same time it just becomes a bit muddy, a bit mushy. So a tiny bit just added there to brighten things up and add a little bit more sideways space as well. This little fella I do like. Let's go on to the other screen. We won't worry about that. It's a thing that you can get for free, and it will saturate per band of EQ, 3 bands of EQ, and a little bit of saturation overall. Subtle. I try to be subtle in the masters. I really do. I think that if you're looking to do a lot of work in your masters, then your mix is wrong. Stop what you're doing, turn the processes off, go back to your mix. What is it that you're trying to bring out? And that's exactly what I did. That's why at one stage here I actually bypassed these to show you my mix, because I came back and did these once I was halfway through this, and was like, yeah, I'm trying to push that snare, I'm trying to push some of that brightness at that point. So then I came back and redid the way that I had reverberated my drums. Better to fix it here at the instrument level than it is to fix it in the mix or the master level, because then you're messing with all the instruments at once. Why do that when you've got access to the instruments? So never get lazy and try and fix it here in the masters, fix it in the mix. This is a rare thing for me to use. I'm not a fan of these, but we didn't have a very stereo mix in the first place. We'll go back and have a look at the mixer. Remember, he sent me a pile of these tracks, and I have tried moving some left and right and what have you, but with the exception of the driven guitars, there's not natural stereo happening in here. And I prefer stereo to be brought by naturally than to be made. And I did a little bit of so one guitar, 2 guitars, so a little bit of this EQ thing to make left and right sound separate from each other. But if you want them to sound really different from each other, you need a new performance. So if you're looking to create a wider sound, yeah, you can cheat, but it will never sound right. It'll sound fake. Just like auto-tuning sounds fake, the performances never really sound authentic or passionate. Which is part of why I guess they get into the whole because the auto-tuning thing, it sounds, hello, I am singing to you. It's wrong. So I would prefer not to get into doing this. Let's take the same performance, split it left, right, and do separate things to it. It sort of works, but you never get that dual axe attack, because a dual axe attack comes from 2 different performers, or at least the one performer giving 2 different performances. If they're exactly the same performance, you can only separate them with trickery, and the ear will hear the difference. We're attuned to very subtle things, and if we realize that the subtle differences are the same all the way through, we go, liar, even if we don't have the ability to understand, oh, you've created stereo by using a stereo chorus. But as soon as we realize, oh, it only does this, that's the only way it's stereo, the brain actually turns off, because it's not interesting, it's predictable. So even though I've got little differences here, the brain will go, oh, okay, they're essentially the same thing. Whereas if they're two different performances, one of the guitarists pushes his backbeat a little harder than the other, the brain's constantly going, ooh, they're different. And it's exciting, which is why the twin axe attack is so exciting. So advice, if you're recording and you're going to want to do the stereo thing, give it a second performance, or give it 3 performances. Your best one down the middle, and a pair out the side. Same goes with vocals. So I didn't get as much stereo as I wanted. I pushed it the hardest with the driven guitars to try and get them to come around, because the delay might be one of those things that you send around, but it was going to be sort of too washy, and it wasn't stereo enough to do that without me causing some serious weirdness. So back to the rack. I added in a stereo imager. That is unusual for me. So we can hear it more there as it sort of comes around in those driven guitars. Sorry, I may have actually not had you hear the other one, so I'll scoot back an A-B through this. These are not the best cans in the world, but they do their job. Okay, so all of these are off. So it's adding that little bit of reverb. Just notice that the mix becomes a little fuller. So now we'll look at the here. Just adding that little bit of spark. So the stereo widener is just picking out some of that snare, which is why I made this somewhat ridiculously bright echoey reverb in there for that widener to grab and pull out a little bit. So it pulls out a little bit of that snare and some of the metal work on the top of the kit, and it's pulling out some of the brighter parts of that driven guitar, the sweeter portions of the stuff, which is good because that's what I liked in those sounds. So it's pulled them out a little bit. Now saturation knob, I had some saturation happening in here. I thought I could probably use a little bit more because it's just something about the mix that I really like, but at the same time it can feel a little sterile at times, which is part of why I thought it might have been MIDI, but apparently the guitars and basses and were actually played, so only the drums were MIDI. The Softies saturation knob does have a fundamental flaw, but for a freebie we don't complain, just that as you add drive here it adds volume, which means it's a little hard to really compare honestly, because the brain always likes louder. Even if it's not a good idea, it always thinks louder is better. So A-Bing is always a bit of a danger with this fella, but I'm looking more for liveliness than for volume. I try and ignore the volume boost and look for a liveliness boost, and I feel like we get it. Yes, it gets louder, but I think we add a little bit of liveliness. I absolutely don't want to push this, because the last thing I want to do is to start to add noticeable distortion. So if you do go down this path of putting saturation in your masters, or several layers of saturation as we've got here, then subtlety is the way to go. You don't want to drive it to clipping. Now this fellow, Selix gain, all I'm using it primarily for here is to check my levels. So that's telling me at the moment I've got 2 dB before I hit 0 dB. So that just sort of says to me, look, I'll drive my whole mix by a few dB, so little clip here. I could well do it here, but I like that this actually has the gauge that tells me what's going on. Not a big fan of using visual meters, but that's kind of cool. I know how much I'm clipping by, and you'll see I'm clipping by a very small amount, and that is deliberate. The other thing I use is for always check in mono, always. That way you can hear what's happening with your stereo when you, especially if you're using a widener, then you can collapse it in and you can hear what goes wrong. Because if this is doing some phase cancellations, you want to know when you put it to mono. Don't seem to have any problems, so it stays in. The limiter here. When I'm mixing, tracking, what have you, I'll have a soft clip on just so I can't send anything through my speakers. But I will not mix into this. If I see this flashing at all as I'm mixing, I'm going to pull my mix back. Even if I have to grab my seller gain and put it into negative numbers. I do not want to mix into any kind of compression. I know it's popular in EDM, but it's a really terrible thing, especially when you're working with more natural material, to mix into any kind of compression, because then you can't hear what's going on. I'll put it into the look ahead mode, because I don't really want to rely on soft clip here. I've got it happening a bit already. You might have even noticed there was a little bit of clipping there, just as it was hitting that. As usual, I'll shave off a fraction of a decibel there, just because I don't want a full 0 dB hitting the ads. Because some digital to analog converters, whether it be in car players or apparently some audiophile converters as well, will have a total cow if they are given a full 0 dB signal. They will just go splat. If it's audiophile, they're not going to be impressed, because suddenly they're hearing the thing they never ever want to hear. If it's a kid in his Lancer with a Kenwood with 1,000 watt sub or something, and his DA converter has a cow at 0 dB, it's entirely possible that his sub will get launched into low Earth orbit. He is also not going to be impressed. So part of your job, if you are doing the mixing or anything like that at a time, shave off just that tiny fraction before you go to your final master, because that way you've ensured that if there is an issue with somebody else's converter, you've accounted for it. That is your job if you're mixing. So you always shave off a tiny bit. So I could go louder, but you'll see I've got that 12 dB difference here. We'll push it a little bit. Yep, the limiter's handling it quite nicely, but I don't like it. It's already within a few seconds starting to sound tiring because you've lost that dynamic range. Let it breathe. So really, I think that sort of covers all of this. We've picked up stems. We've taken time to understand the stems. The client has ultimately chosen to engage and help me understand what his stems were about, which is great. That's helped me in the end. I've made mixed decisions and gone straight from first to what we might call third mix. I've decided, okay, that's the way I want to try hearing this, based on what I've got. I hope you found this informative. Remember, this wasn't really a mix tutorial. You got some of that towards the end here, but this is really about understanding what happens when you send your music off to a mix engineer to mix and turn your music into something amazing. Thank you very much for your time. If you ever want my assistance, you can find me. Thank you.